So today we're talking about prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination. And I want you to begin by looking at these two pictures right here. Take a look at these two individuals and consider what characteristics of each of them you first notice. What aspects of their physical appearance, or perhaps their gender. And more broadly, which of these two individuals do you think you would choose as a partner to work with on a class project, if you had to choose? A or B? And think about why. What are the associated personality characteristics that you might associate with the physical appearance of these two individuals? Consider also these two individuals. Which of these two do you think would be more likely to emerge as a campus leader, president of a student association, person A or person B? And again, why? Which of these two individuals would be more likely to be hired following a job interview? A or B? And again, it may depend on the job, but think about the very same job and consider whether A or B is more likely to receive the offer. And again, why? And finally, consider which of these two individuals you would be most likely to introduce to your parents as a new friend or perhaps a new girlfriend. A or B? And again, why? Now, in talking about prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes, it's really easy to start to consider good examples of prejudice from across the world and from different points in time. I think many of us who have grown up in Canada over the last couple of decades have this sense that Canada is a wonderful, multicultural, welcoming nation, this wonderful mosaic of cultures, which is relatively unprejudiced compared with much of the rest of the world. But in some sense, I think this is a bit of a fallacy, and there are some who in fact go so far as to say that Canada puts the A in racism. And here are some good examples, historic examples. So here's an example of a poster from Penticton. This is a bit of a white supremacist movement between the First and Second World Wars. And it's startling to look at this poster today. But of course, this is very much Canadian history, as is the treatment of Japanese Canadian citizens during the Second World War. And of course, these are startling examples because you can see this is right here. The poster on the right cites places like New Westminster, Port Moody, Port Coquitlam, places perhaps where some of you live right now. And these are not isolated examples. We can point to, for example, the reception of the passengers on the Komagata Maru. We can talk about the Chinese head tax. And of course, we can continue to talk about the reception of Syrian refugees and controversies within Canada concerning the wearing of the niqab during citizenship ceremonies. Yes, prejudice is certainly a part of the Canadian fabric. Now, to take this further, let's look at some interesting data from a Ledger marketing poll from a few years ago, where, according to this particular sample, 68%, so roughly 2/3 of the sample, had heard a racist comment uttered over the last year, a racial epithet. Slightly higher, the proportion of 18 to 24-year-olds. When you're looking at actual racist behavior, somebody being treated differently because of their racial or ethnic background, yes, close to 1/3 of Canadians have witnessed it. And again, almost about half of younger Canadians. So it doesn't seem to be going away as a particular problem either. And what might surprise some of you is, of course, that when you look across BC, you see the highest rise across the country. But at the same time, of course, I'm trying to point out with this slide that there's a bit of tension over here because we do live in a largely multicultural nation. And in fact, in the next 15 years or so, 1 out of every 3 Canadians will be from a visible minority background. And that's much higher, of course, in the case of the large cities. So something like 59% of Vancouverites and 62% of Torontonians will also be from an ethnic minority background. And that's fascinating, but that's also worth mentioning because when we talk about this, it looks like there's a bit of a tension. Why are we seeing an increase in racism while at the same time we're seeing an increase in the number of visible minorities? And one point that's useful to make early on, of course, is that another assumption people make when we talk about prejudice is as we're talking about something that has to do a characteristic, a feature of the largest ethnic group. So let's be quite clear about this. when we talk about prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination, we are not describing a particular quality of behavior of Caucasian Canadians. No, we are talking about human nature. And so, in fact, of course, ethnic minorities have their own prejudices against one another as well as against the majority, vice versa. We are truly describing human nature. We are not describing a particular quality about Caucasian people. So, a few things we're going to cover during this first video and a couple of others in the one that will follow. In this one, we're going to talk about what prejudice exactly is. And we'll start by talking about what I call three components of prejudice, three sort of different ways to understand the bases of it. And we'll also discuss a few related concepts, important concepts, including the notion of automatic prejudice and a very interesting research on stereotype threat. And finally, we'll look at some examples, a very specific example of a study that looked at workplace discrimination as well. The next video will focus on what causes prejudice, and we'll explore a couple of theoretical explanations for it. Of course, there are many others, but we're going to explore two of them during the second video, as well as how we might reduce prejudice with particular emphasis on a strategy known as a superordinate goal. So let's start by talking about what prejudice actually is. Again, prejudice is a general term, but as psychologists, we tend to use terms more specifically. And the first way to look at prejudice is as the affect. Now, affect, of course, is just another word for emotions or feelings. And that's truly what prejudice refers to for psychologists, is the negative emotional reaction to a particular group, or rather to a particular individual, based solely on their membership in a particular group. But you can also look at stereotypes, and these are the cognitions or thoughts that one might have about the member of a particular group. So, assuming that all members of this group are like this, they have these particular qualities. Those would be the stereotypes, and that's cognition or attitudes or beliefs. And finally, of course, we have behavior, which is how you actually treat someone. Behavior, observable, visible behavior, and that would be called discrimination. Now, keep in mind, you can often have all three of these, but you can have any combination of these. There might be a situation in which you harbor stereotypes about members of a particular group, and perhaps you even have a negative emotional reaction when you encounter members of that particular group. But perhaps because you work, let's say, for the city or for the government, you know you cannot discriminate against those individuals because you might, in fact, lose your job. Doing so would be deeply illegal. And so you manage to control your prejudicial tendencies and do not discriminate actually. But of course, inside you experience prejudice and hold stereotypes. So let's take this slightly more slowly and a bit more in depth. Prejudice. So this is described, as you can see, as a negative prejudgment of a group and its members. It is an emotional reaction. This is the affective component. But it's the word prejudgment that's most useful over here. So it literally has nothing to do with the specific individual, their personality, their behavior, anything that they've said or done. This is literally writing off a member of a group and, of course, the entire group based on the existence of the group or the membership of that group. Now, if you look back to when we talked about attitudes earlier in the course, we distinguished between implicit and explicit attitudes. And, of course, with prejudice, it's very useful to make this distinction as well. Explicit attitudes, of course, are the ones that we consciously hold. We're aware that we have these attitudes, and those are the attitudes that largely predict explicit or controlled or deliberate behavior. On the other hand, you have implicit attitudes, which, of course, are unconscious, uncontrollable, involuntary, and often outside of our awareness. And these are the attitudes that tend to predict more spontaneous behavior. And of course, we know that there's not often a great relationship between implicit and explicit attitudes, but it is useful and important, actually, to follow and study prejudice at both of these levels. There are many individuals who will explicitly deny holding any prejudicial attitudes, of course, but implicitly they might have these negative associations across the groups. So, briefly, I'm going to mention the work of Patricia Devine, who looked at what's called automatic prejudice. And so there's different ways in which you can measure this, but she's really interested in looking at individuals who perhaps explicitly do not hold prejudice, so they do not endorse or hold to their knowledge prejudicial attitudes. But at the same time, if you measure their implicit attitudes, using the IAT, they in fact might reveal a tendency to be quicker to associate negative thoughts, characteristics, and behaviors with members of a particular group than members of a different group. And so what Patricia Devine found, of course, is that when you increase the cognitive load of the individuals who are not explicitly prejudiced, but yes, they are implicitly prejudiced, she finds that these individuals tend to slip into what she refers to as automatic prejudice. Now, this is not true for all of them, but at least for some of these individuals, it appears that they are actively exercising some control over these implicit attitudes. And when you ask them to perform a task that uses their mental space, that increases their cognitive load, as we say, it could be as straightforward as having them hold a long sequence of digits in their mind for a certain length of time. Essentially give them something that occupies their cognitive or mental resources. And when you do that, the control that they were exerting to not allow the implicit attitudes to be revealed explicitly is minimized, and so then you're more likely to see the explicit prejudice occur. And that's why she refers to it as automatic prejudice. All right, so let's talk about stereotypes now. With stereotypes, of course, as I mentioned, we're talking about beliefs or attitudes about the characteristics of members of a particular group. So this could be the idea, for example, very popular stereotype within the Lower Mainland, or let's say Asians are good at math. And that's a useful example because it is a stereotype, of course. It is by definition an overgeneralization concerning the characteristics or abilities of members of an entire group, a large, diverse group. And this is an interesting one because it sounds positive, doesn't it? But given that it's an overgeneralization, of course, it is very much negative in that sense. There are other stereotypes, of course, that sound very much like they are negative. Another example, of course, would be, let's say, Asians being bad drivers is the very popular stereotype in the Lower Mainland, oddly enough. Certainly not the stereotype in Asia. And I'm going to pick up on this for a moment because I think this is an extremely prevalent stereotype within the Lower Mainland and indeed among students as well. And the power of a stereotype like this, and in particular, why these stereotypes persist and have such traction and have such power, is often due to what's known as an illusory correlation. So, of course, you remember a correlation, and indeed a correlation coefficient, denotes the relationship between two variables, the strength and direction. But an illusory correlation is the idea that we tend to perceive that two variables have a relationship between them, even in fact if they do not. And of course over here, with the stereotype about Asians and bad driving, we're talking about a perceived and illusory correlation between ethnicity and driving ability. Greatly debatable whether this is actually true. But consider this. Imagine you are driving down the road, and imagine that you notice that there's someone right next to you driving, and they're driving rather poorly. They're cutting across lanes, they are not staying within their lane, and let's say they narrowly avoid hitting your car. They're not using their turning signals, they're not shoulder checking, and you glare at them. Now, of course, you might look over and you say, wow, there's an Asian. Now, if this is true, if this was actually an Asian, it's interesting because we're going to have a bit of a confirmation bias over here. You are well aware of the stereotype concerning Asians and bad driving. And so if you happen to see an Asian driving poorly, you're going to remember this. You're going to remember this more than any other possibility. You're certainly going to remember this much more than if you look over and you see a non-Asian engaging in that bad driving behavior, because that doesn't fit your stereotype. It's not going to be as easy for you to process. You are not going to pay attention to it as much. You're therefore not going to remember it as much. Similarly, if you consider all of the Asians driving around you, let's say there's an Asian who's driving exceptionally well. They're driving within their lanes, they're using their turning signals, everything else. When someone's driving perfectly beautifully, you don't look over and glare at them. You never notice, you never bother looking. So you're going to ignore all the cases of Asians who are driving well. You're going to ignore all the cases of the Caucasians driving well. You're going to ignore the cases of the Caucasians driving poorly in a relative sense. The one example that you're going to pay attention to much more, of course, are the Asians who are driving poorly. And because you are more likely to pay attention and therefore remember this particular example, you tend to believe that there's an actual relationship, as if you were actually paying attention to all of these cases equally, which you're not. So that's the bit about the illusory correlation. Another thing related to stereotypes itself is called stereotype threat. And this is really interesting research largely by Claude Steele at Stanford University and his colleagues. And it concerns when you are reminded of a stereotype that applies to a group that you belong to. What is the effect of that on your performance? There's, of course, a lot of research that's taken place on this particular subject. And what we find is that as soon as someone is reminded of a stereotype that applies to their group, this starts to play on their mind. And this worry, this negative thinking, tends to affect their performance negatively. But of course, on the surface of it, for people who hold the stereotype, the poor performance of these individuals only tends to confirm the stereotype. So as a quick example, in the typical study by Claude Steele and his colleagues, they would have men and women, undergraduate students, equally matched on math ability, equally good. Bring them into the class and say that they're going to be taking a rather challenging math test. But now imagine that the group is randomly assigned into two halves, men and women in each. For one half, the control group, you go to them and you say, well, so you may have heard that men and women, you may have heard that women tend to perform more poorly on tests of math ability, but that's not true for this particular test. So they essentially say that the stereotype does not apply for this particular test. It will be a challenging test. Best of luck, let's go. But for the experimental group, you say, well, you may have heard that women tend to perform poor on tests of math ability, but don't worry about that, just do your best. So really all you've done in the experimental group is remind the participants of the stereotype concerning women and math ability. And what you find at the end is even though the participants in either condition are equally matched on math ability, if you look at their actual performance on the math exam, you find that participants in the control group perform very differently from those in the experimental. Specifically, women in the experimental group perform significantly more poorly than women in the control group. So it is really true that being reminded of a stereotype that applies to your group actually starts to negatively affect your performance. On the flip side, the men in this particular group, in this particular study, actually performed better when they were told that they performed better than the average woman. So it appears that stereotype threat can work either way. But of course, in some cases, it's not even performance that's poor because you worry. In some cases, when you're reminded of a stereotype that applies to your group in a particular context, it causes people to get so despondent that they essentially withdraw from the activity itself, which again is a negative outcome, but can be also understood through the same mechanism. All right, so what are the implications of this? Certainly there are stereotypes that apply to all of the groups that we are parts of. And so you think about social identity theory that we've talked about before, and all of the hundreds, if not more, social identities that you hold based on your major of study, where you live, sports teams that you're a fan of, your nationality, ethnicity, religion, etc. All of these are social identities. And each of these typically have stereotypes associated with them. And so the point over here, of course, is that for people who actually hold the stereotypes, let's say there's an outsider, let's say there is a math instructor who truly believes that women shouldn't be taking his class. It's a terrible concept, of course. The person would be an idiot to have these sorts of beliefs, but there are such individuals out there, plenty of idiots. But if they hold this belief and they come to the classroom and they say, listen, I never recommended that women take the class in the first place, but fine, you've decided to stick around, here's your exam. What they've essentially done is provoke stereotype threat. And if the women in the class now start to worry about the stereotype, therefore performing worse, not because of their lesser ability, but because of the stereotype threat, for the idiotic instructor in this case, they really just receive and witness, as far as they're concerned, support. Right? They will look at it and say, well, I was right all along. Certainly it's true in my class, once again, that the women perform more poorly on this test of math ability. But it was caused by them, not actual ability. All right. So the third basis, of course, is discrimination. And over here, we're talking about treating someone differently. So differential behaviors, usually negative, of course, but not always, not necessarily, and directed towards another person or group based on their membership in a group. So when I say usually negative, of course, this means that it's not always the case. And so this could even include, for example, affirmative action strategies that try to advantage particular groups based on historical mistreatment or reduced access to resources or education. But a good example of discrimination, of course, is with the workplace. So here's a fascinating study that I think you'll find quite interesting by Aureopolis, who at the time in 2009 was doing work at UBC. They essentially took advantage of the online job application websites like Monster.ca and Workopolis, and they sent out 6,000 fictitious, made-up resumes to potential employers in response to these online job postings. Now, of course, they took essentially the same resume and they systematically varied specific details of the resume, one detail at a time, and they sent out hundreds of copies of each of the versions of these resumes. They changed just the ethnicity of the names while keeping everything else the same. In other cases, they changed whether or not the resume mentioned foreign work experience, fluency in multiple languages, and the specific place, country, location where the individual obtained their undergraduate degree. And the dependent variable in this case, even though these were fictitious examples, was of course the callback rate. What proportion of these applicants received callbacks for interviews? And what you find, of course, is not essentially inspiring. Even in supposedly enlightened multicultural Canada, we find that English-named applicants with Canadian experience, so think your prototypical, John Smith, 16% was the average callback rate, which is not bad when you consider the typical callback rate for online job postings. Chinese-named applicants with foreign experience appeared to have two strikes against them. The name, which presumably some potential employers used as a heuristic to try and guess about their ability to communicate in English. And of course, the foreign experience only underlining that. And so if you've ever wondered why friends of yours who are of Chinese descent, who indeed have a Chinese name, tend to also operate or have a more anglicized name, this might actually be a viable reason why. It's very pragmatic. It's almost protecting yourself from discrimination that you can actually anticipate. The same is true for Indian or Pakistani named applicants with foreign experience. Again, roughly about a third of the rate of callbacks as the English named applicants. And finally, British applicants. This is again another foreign group, but no different, the callback rate from English named applicants. So it does seem to be something concerning perceived ability to communicate and ethnicity in terms of being a visible minority, as opposed to just being foreign, because of course British applicants would also be foreign. And finally, perhaps the most damning one of all is that Canadian applicants, right, not foreign experience, but Canadian local applicants with the same history, same training, same experience, same education, same languages spoken, the same. The only thing being different was their Chinese, Indian, or Pakistani names. They too suffered lower callback rates than English named applicants with exactly the same experience. So again, prejudice is not something that's going away, and discrimination certainly isn't either. But one force that seems to certainly affect when and how much prejudice and discrimination we tend to see is, interestingly, the relative amount of resources that Canadians get to enjoy. So here's an interesting graph that shows you, and you can certainly see this looks like a very strong positive correlation, which it is, between two variables. So the straight line is a year-on-year survey across Canada that asks Canadians between 1975 and 1995 whether we should decrease the amount of people immigrating to the country. So it's people who believe we should decrease immigration across a 20-year period. And during the same period, the dotted line, of course, is the unemployment rate. And what this suggests, once again, is that there is this relationship. The more competition for limited resources we see within a given society, the more likely you are to actually witness an increase in prejudice. And on the surface, of course, It's very powerful, these sorts of arguments, the notion that, of course it makes sense. We can't let more immigrants come in when the unemployment rate is high in this country. We don't have jobs. How can we allow other people to come in at this time? It has this veneer, this surface, superficial appearance and appeal of logic. But of course, it is entirely illogical. So if you actually look at the data concerning immigrants and contributions to society, it is far more likely for immigrants to be creating jobs than actually ending up stealing jobs, as it were, from Canadians who were born in Canada. And this, of course, includes jobs in the service sector that typically go unfilled and are more likely to be filled by immigrant groups. So those are some provocative ideas, certainly, in terms of workplace discrimination based on names and changes in discrimination or the degree of discrimination or prevalence of discrimination in mainstream Canadian society based on things like the unemployment rate. And this, in fact, brings us to the end of the first video. You've stuck with me for 26 minutes, and I do appreciate that. But take a break. If you haven't watched the video by Jane Elliott about a class divided, please do so now, because that's going to be very relevant in the next half of this lecture. Thank you.